My mother introduced me to 400 elite guests as her gluttonous, fat hippo. The whole hall roared with laughter until a legendary 4-star general dropped his wine glass and saluted me as his commanding officer. I'm Josephine Davenport. My family thought I was a failure to be mocked. They didn't realize I was the one holding the keys to their destruction. But before the crystal shattered and the truth stood up to claim this house, I was just a silhouette waiting in the damp Georgia dark for the storm to finally break. The humid air of Savannah clung to my skin like a damp wool blanket, thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the cloying metallic tang of expensive lilies. I stood in the deep shadows of a centuries-old oak tree on the edge of the Davenport estate, my navy blue charcoal dress acting as a camouflage against the evening gloom. From this distance, the grand ballroom looked like a glowing cage of gold and crystal, housing 400 of Georgia's elite. I adjusted my posture, the muscle memory of 20 years in uniform making my spine as straight as a bayonet. I watched them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I didn't see friends or neighbors. I saw behavioral cues and security vulnerabilities. It was a habit I couldn't switch off. I have commanded battalions through blinding dust storms where you couldn't see your own hand. Yet here, in the house that raised me, I was expected to be invisible. I took a steady breath, feeling the phantom itch of a shrapnel scar beneath my ribs, a souvenir from a desert road that my family knew nothing about. At the center of the hall, Montgomery and Eugenia Davenport held court. My mother was radiant in silver silk, her smile practiced and predatory, while my father stood beside her like a well-groomed monument to his own ego. I could see the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for a champagne flute, a telltale sign of the financial desperation hidden beneath the high-end makeup and the borrowed jewelry. They were performing for an audience they could no longer afford. I moved toward the back entrance, passing my siblings, Lysander and Cressida. They looked through me as if I were a pane of glass, their laughter sharp and condescending as they gossiped with a senator's children. I didn't mind the coldness, it was the familiarity of it that stung. As I navigated the service hallway, I saw a young waiter fumbling with a heavy tray, his face pale with nerves. I reached out, steadying the edge of the silver platter with a firm hand. "Keep your head up, son," I whispered, my voice calm and steady. "A storm outside doesn't mean the ship has to sink. Just watch your footing." He gave me a look of pure gratitude before disappearing into the crowd. The quiet, pressurized tension shifted when I reached the pantry. I overheard a frantic, hushed argument near the kitchen door. My parents were cornered by the catering manager, Mr. Sterling. I recognized the look on my father's face, the panic of a man whose bluff had been called. Their corporate card had been declined for the $15,000 vintage wine shipment, and the vendor was refusing to pour another drop until the balance was cleared. "I'm sure it's just a banking error, Arthur," my mother hissed, her eyes darting around to see if anyone was listening. "We'll have it sorted by Monday." "Monday doesn't pay my distributors tonight, Eugenia," Mr. Sterling replied, his voice firm. I didn't wait for them to beg. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they needed me. I intercepted Mr. Sterling in the dim hallway as my parents retreated in shame. Without a word of boast, I slid my high-limit military black card across the ledger he was holding. He looked at the card, then up at me, his eyes widening as he recognized the government-issued emblem. "Josephine?" he breathed, his voice full of surprise. "Your parents are in a difficult spot." "No," I replied, my voice a flat, tactical hum. "They are just overextended. Process the payment. All of it." I watched him swipe the card, the transaction clearing instantly. I made him sign a discreet deed of gift for the expenses, a legal precaution Gideon had taught me. I wasn't doing this to be a martyr. I was doing it because true honor isn't about who sees you do the right thing. It's about doing it because the alternative is to become the very chaos you're trying to prevent. "Tell them the bank had a glitch," I instructed. "Let them keep their pride. It's the only thing they have left to lose." I retreated further into the kitchen, seeking a moment of relative silence. The pain in my side flared, a sharp reminder that I had skipped my tactical rations. I reached into my small clutch, pulled out a prescribed glucose tablet, and took a small, dry piece of sourdough from a cooling rack. It was a medical necessity to stabilize my system after a grueling deployment, but to an outsider, it looked like a moment of weakness. The kitchen door swung open with a violent thud. My mother stood there, her face contorting with a disgust that went deeper than the skin. "Still the same gluttonous fat girl, Josephine?" she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "Even tonight, you can't stop shoveling food into your face. You're a disgrace to the Davenport name. The least you can do is pretend to have some self-control while we're trying to save this family's reputation." I didn't flinch. I didn't reveal the wound that was currently burning like a hot coal. I simply put the bread down and wiped my fingers with surgical precision. Looking at her, I realized she saw a fat hippo, eating in the dark. She didn't see a soldier sustaining herself for a war she didn't know was coming. "The guests are waiting, Mother," I said quietly. "You should be on stage." She grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong, dragging me toward the light of the ballroom for the public introductions. I followed, my eyes reflecting a calm so profound it was terrifying. I have stood before generals and dictators without blinking. My mother thought she was leading me to a slaughter, but I was simply marking the time. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. Have you ever been the only one holding a roof up, while the people inside tell you that you're the burden? I watched the stage lights flicker to life as the applause for my parents rose like a tidal wave, unaware that the woman they were about to mock was the only reason the lights were still on. My mother adjusted her pearls with a predatory smile, her eyes catching mine as she leaned toward the microphone, ready to turn my silence into the evening's entertainment. The stage lights blinded me, white and hot, stripping away the comfort of the shadows I had occupied for so long. Eugenia Davenport led the way, her silk heels clicking against the mahogany floor with the rhythm of a firing squad. Behind her trailed Montgomery, Lysander, and Cressida, the golden Davenports, moving with the effortless grace of people who had never known a day of true labor. They mounted the stage like royalty ascending a throne, but they left me at the very foot of the stairs. I stood in the pit of the ballroom, caught in the harsh, unflattering glare of the perimeter spots. Looking back now, I should have seen the theater for what it was. Cressida didn't waste a second. She stabilized her phone on a carbon fiber gimbal, her face illuminated by the soft blue glow of the screen as she began her live stream. She wasn't just recording a family memory, she was broadcasting a brand. Her lens panned across the shimmering audience of 400, then settled on me. She tilted the camera intentionally, catching the plain drape of my charcoal dress against the backdrop of a catering cart. I was the visual before to her after. I felt the heat of 1,000 invisible eyes through her screen, but I maintained a parade rest posture, my hands clasped behind my back. A lighthouse doesn't seek the approval of the waves. It simply stands so the ships don't break. The weight of those judgmental gazes was a physical pressure, a suffocating humidity that filled the lungs. I could hear the muffled whispers from the front tables, the governor's wife leaning toward her husband, the soft, tinkling laughter of socialites who measured worth by the label on a neckline. They saw a woman who didn't fit the Davenport mold. They saw a failure. Yet even as Cressida tracked my every move with a mocking lens, I noticed a flicker of distress near the edge of the stage. An elderly family friend, Mr. Abernathy, was struggling with a malfunctioning microphone stand. The feedback was a sharp, piercing whine that made the nearest guests wince. Without breaking my stride or my composure, I stepped forward. My siblings watched with disdain, but I reached the stand and adjusted the tension screw with the surgical precision I had used to calibrate navigation systems in the belly of a transport plane. I cleared the feedback and gave Meister Abernathy a small, steady nod. He whispered a shaky, "Thank you, Josephine." But my siblings only saw it as a servant performing a task. Kindness is never a weakness, but in this room, it was a language they had long ago chosen to forget. I didn't realize it then, but that small act was the last shred of grace I would offer the Davenport name tonight. Eugenia stepped to the center of the stage, tapping the microphone. The sound boomed through the hall, effectively silencing the 400 elite guests. She looked radiant, her pearls glowing like cold white teeth against her silver gown. She began her speech by introducing the Golden Trio. She spoke of Lysander's visionary business ventures, neglecting to mention the black hole of debt I was currently subsidizing. She praised Cressida's influence, failing to acknowledge that it was built on a foundation of hollow vanity. Every word was a brick in a wall of lies, and the audience swallowed it whole. Then the air in the room seemed to thin. Eugenia's gaze shifted from the crowd down to me, still standing at the foot of the stage. Her smile curled with a cloying, sugary poison that made my skin crawl. "And finally," she said, her voice dripping with a fake, theatrical sigh that reached every corner of the ballroom and every viewer on Cressida's phone. "Our youngest, Josephine. We call her our little investment that never quite matured. While her siblings were building empires, Josephine was, well, she was always just taking up space." She paused for effect, letting the silence ripen into something jagged. "This is our gluttonous, fat hippo," Eugenia proclaimed, her laugh bright and cruel. "She takes up as much space as she does our patience. But I suppose every family needs a reminder of what happens when ambition is absent." The hall erupted. It wasn't a roar, but a ripple, the polite, tinkling laughter of the wealthy that eventually sharpened into audible mockery. I saw Cressida zoom in, her eyes gleaming as the likes and comments flooded her screen, mocking the sister she had just turned into a global punchline. I stood as still as a statue, the insults hitting me like a physical wind. In that moment, the betrayal wasn't just a word, it was a visceral ache that settled deep in the marrow of my bones. I watched my mother's triumphant face and realized a devastating truth. They weren't just mocking my body. They were trying to bury the woman I had become in the sand of who they wanted me to be. To be hated for the truth is a tragedy, but to be loved for a lie is a slow, agonizing death. I understood then that I had been erased from their hearts long before I was erased from their dignity. I didn't cry, I didn't flinch, I didn't run for the exits. I simply stood there, my eyes reflecting a calm so profound it began to make the nearest guests at the VIP tables visibly uncomfortable. I began to shift my focus, using the tactical detachment that had kept me alive in combat zones. I documented their faces, the politicians, the judges, the so-called friends of the family. I realized that a room full of 400 people can be the loneliest place on earth if it lacks a single ounce of honor. I wasn't the one being exposed tonight. They were. At the back of the room, near the heavy oak door, I met Gideon Sterling's gaze. His jaw was clenched so tightly I could see the muscles in his neck tensing. His hand rested on his phone, his thumb hovering above the screen in a silent tactical readiness. We exchanged a wordless glance. The compression, the pressure they had spent decades building up, had finally reached its breaking point. The release, was no longer an option. It was inevitable. I didn't know what awaited me next, but I knew I was no longer playing the role of Davenport the hippo. As the laughter began to die down, replaced by a lingering, awkward hum, I didn't wait for my mother to dismiss me. I simply gave the stage a short, sharp nod, a gesture of acknowledging a challenge, the way a soldier acknowledges an enemy position before the breach. I turned on my heel and began to walk toward the back of the hall. Every step was rhythmic, heavy, and purposeful, the sound of my shoes on the hardwood floor a steady drumbeat in the sudden quiet. I didn't realize it then, but I was no longer walking away from a party. I was walking toward a reckoning. Sometimes the person who gave you life is the one who tries hardest to take your spirit. How do you stay standing when everyone is laughing? The champagne bubbles hissed in the silence that followed my exit, a sharp contrast to the cold, tactical fury settling in my chest as I prepared to meet the one man who could turn this ballroom into a battlefield. The mahogany doors of the private study clicked shut, sealing out the rhythmic thrum of the anniversary waltz. In the sudden silence, the air felt thin and heavy, smelling of old leather and the stale, sweet scent of my father's expensive bourbon. Montgomery Davenport didn't waste a second. He collapsed into a wingback chair, his hand clawing at his silk tie as if he were suffocating. His face contorted into a masterful performance of agony, his skin turning a sickly theatrical gray under the dim library lamps. I watched him with the clinical detachment of a combat medic. I had seen real men die in the dirt, their eyes searching for a home they would never see again. This was not that. He fumbled with a heavy envelope on the desk, sliding a confidential medical report toward me with trembling fingers. It claimed his heart was a ticking time bomb, a failing engine with only months left to run. "Josephine," he wheezed, his voice a jagged rasp of calculated desperation. "This is it. The end of the Davenport line if you don't step up." He produced a promissory note, a legal snare for a $5 million personal guarantee. Sign this. Save our legacy before I'm gone. It's your final chance to prove you aren't the failure your mother says you are. Do it for the family. I didn't reach for the pen. Instead, my eyes, trained for battlefield reconnaissance, scanned the document. The inconsistencies in the hospital letterhead were subtle, but to me, they screamed like a siren. I watched the rhythm of his chest. His breathing was too shallow, too deliberate for a man in cardiac distress. He was weaponizing his own mortality to bait a trap. I looked at him with a mix of hollow pity and cold clarity. He thought he was playing on my heartstrings, but he was only cutting the final thread that held me to this house. Honor cannot be forged, Dad, I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as a stone, and I will not sign a lie. I turned toward the door, leaving him to sputter in the shadows of his own making. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, the kind of peace that comes when you finally realize the monster under the bed is just an old man with a script. I walked back into the grand ballroom, the transition from the dark study to the brilliant chandeliers feeling like an intentional slap. The hall was a sea of 400 elite guests, their champagne glasses clinking in a symphony of superficial joy. Then the heavy oak entrance doors swung open, and a sudden pressurized silence rippled through the room. General Alaric Thorne, a 4-star legend and a man whose name was whispered in the halls of the Pentagon like a prayer, entered the hall. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Eugenia Davenport didn't hesitate. She abandoned her conversation with a state senator, smoothing her silver silks as she rushed toward the general with a predatory smile of social desperation. I stood in the periphery, but as she approached him, she saw me. She moved with practiced malice, trying to shove me further into the shadows of a marble pillar. "Get out of the way, Josephine," she hissed, her voice a low venom. "A real hero has arrived. Don't embarrass us further with your presence." I didn't move. I stood my ground, my posture shifting into the rigid, unbreakable spine of an officer. The sound of the general's boots on the marble floor was a rhythmic thud, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a drumbeat of war. He didn't look at the champagne or the glittering decor. He looked for a mark. My mother reached him first, her hand outstretched for a social handshake, gushing about the prestige of the Davenport name and the honor of his visit. She was a master of the stage, but she'd forgotten that some men can see right through the curtain. General Thorne didn't even glance at her hand. He ignored her entirely, his eyes locking onto mine with a level of respect that seemed to stop the room's heart. The air in the ballroom went dead. My mother's smile froze, turning into a brittle mask of confusion. Thorne's heels clicked together with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the rafters like a gunshot. In one fluid, powerful motion, he raised his hand in a thunderous, perfect military salute. The 400 guests gasped, the sound a collective intake of breath that chilled the air. "Ma'am, permission to report." Thorne's voice boomed, carrying the weight of decades of command. "The tactical briefing for the Joint Task Force is secure and awaiting your final signature. Colonel Josephine Davenport." The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the wineglass slip from my mother's numb fingers. It hit the floor with a hollow, crystalline shatter, the red wine fanning out like a dark stain of blood across her white silk dress. She didn't even notice. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape, as she looked from the general's stiff salute to the daughter she had called a hippo only moments ago. Looking back now, I realized that the sound of breaking glass is nothing compared to the silence of 400 people realizing they were mocking a hero. I returned the salute, my movements crisp and certain. "Carry on, General," I said, the words ringing with an authority that hadn't been heard in this house for generations. For the first time in my life, I wasn't panicking. I was free. Finally, I had chosen myself. And that's not selfish. It's survival. Have you ever seen the truth finally stand up in a room full of lies? I watched the color drain from my mother's face as the word colonel echoed through the rafters, a sound more powerful than any insult she had ever hurled at me. The general remained at attention, his eyes never wavering from mine, as the guests began to realize that the woman in the navy dress was the only person in the room who truly understood the meaning of service. That's where it all started. The air in the grand ballroom felt heavy and static, like the charged atmosphere right before a lightning strike. General Thorne's salute still hung in the minds of the 400 guests, a silent accusation that had frozen the room in a tableau of shock. I stood at the center of that silence, my spine rigid, feeling the heat of the stage lights against the cool, tactical detachment settling in my chest. My mother, Eugenia Davenport, stood paralyzed for 3 long seconds, her silver silk dress stained with the dark, spreading fan of red wine from her shattered glass. It looked like a wound. It looked like the truth. But Eugenia was a creature of the spotlight, and the spotlight was failing her. I watched her eyes move, the rapid, predatory flicker of a woman looking for a different script. She didn't crumble. She pivoted. She grabbed a spare microphone from a nearby pedestal, her knuckles whitening around the silver mesh. When she spoke, her voice wasn't sharp. It was honeyed with a false maternal warmth that made my stomach turn. It was the damage control voice she used when the charity ledgers didn't balance, or when a Davenport scandal hit the local papers. "My fellow guests," she began, projecting a fragile, trembling smile toward the crowd. "What you just witnessed, it's a tragedy, really, not a triumph." She looked at General Thorne, then down at me, her eyes brimming with manufactured tears. My poor Josephine. She served, yes, but she suffered a complete mental breakdown on the front lines. Her rank? It's a mercy appointment, a quiet way for the military to handle a woman who lost her mind in the dirt. And her hippo appearance? Simply a side effect of the heavy sedation we, as her loving family, pay for to keep her stable. The room inhaled collectively. I didn't move. I didn't shout. I watched the guests, the governor, the judges, the wealthy donors, their expressions shifting from awe to a terrible, awkward pity. Eugenia had just turned my life's work into a mental health crisis. She signaled to the AV technician at the back of the hall. "We didn't want to show this," she whispered into the mic. "But perhaps it's time you see why we protect her so fiercely." The massive LED screens at the front of the ballroom flickered to life. A grainy, secret video began to play. It was me, 3 years ago, covered in mud and dried blood, sitting on the tailgate of a Humvee after a 72-hour mission. I was staring into the distance, my eyes hollow, my hands trembling as I tried to open a ration pack. I looked broken. I looked unstable. It was a private moment of exhaustion, captured by a family who had been harvesting my scars for their social currency. I stood perfectly still, watching my own trauma being sold as a sob story. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. My mother didn't just steal my childhood, she was trying to turn my soul into a product. Integrity is a silent fire. Once it goes out, the darkness is absolute. She was betting that the room would choose her polished lie over my messy reality. She was wrong. She had forgotten that a Davenport hippo isn't just heavy. It's the most dangerous animal in the river when it's cornered. "And that is why," Eugenia continued, her voice rising with a sudden inspirational energy. "Tonight is not just an anniversary. It is the launch of the Davenport Foundation for Broken Heroes. We ask you to open your hearts and your checkbooks. Help us save soldiers like Josephine who simply cannot help themselves." I felt the pulse of the room change. People reached for their wallets, moved by the courage of a mother supporting her broken daughter. But in the shadows near the entrance, I saw Gideon Sterling. He didn't look at the screen. He looked at his tablet, his thumb moving with a rhythmic, military precision. We had planned for the salute, but we had prepared for the betrayal. I gave him the smallest nod, the signal to initiate hunter mode. Suddenly, the charity video on the LED screens cut to black. A sharp digital screech echoed through the ballroom, silencing Eugenia mid-sentence. When the image returned, it wasn't my face. It was a cold, black-and-white ledger of the Davenport Foundation's internal bank records. Columns of red numbers began to scroll, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing out of the veteran fund and into personal accounts. I stepped onto the stage, my voice like a steel blade cutting through the clinking of champagne glasses. "Under 18 U.S. Code, Section 1040, I said, the words echoing with the weight of federal law. "Fraud in connection with major disaster or emergency benefits carries a 20-year sentence. And under the Stolen Valor Act, using military service to solicit fraudulent donations is a direct violation of federal trust." The silence was now clinical. I walked toward my mother, my boots clicking against the stage with a sound of finality. "You didn't raise money to save me, Mother," I said, my voice low but reaching every ear in the room. "You stole the honor of every soldier who served with me. You used my blood to buy Lysander's luxury cars and Cressida's designer inventories. You didn't harvest my scars to help me. You harvested them to buy your own silence." Eugenia's face went gray, the silver silk of her dress reflecting the cold, digital truth on the screens behind her. Lysander lunged toward Gideon at the back of the room, his face a mask of feral desperation as he realized his luxury lifestyle was one digital signature away from a federal prison cell. But two of General Thorne's security officers blocked his path, their movements as silent and efficient as a closing trap. "The ultimate reveal, Mother," I said, turning to face the 400 guests, "is that I am not your victim. My command is not office work. I lead the Federal Oversight Division that monitors misappropriated veteran funds. I didn't come here to celebrate your anniversary. I came here as your auditor." I looked at my father, Montgomery, who was trembling in his seat, his forged medical report still clutched in his hand. "I gave you 10 years of my silence because I loved the memory of who you used to be," I said softly. "But mercy without accountability is just permission for the poison to spread. A lady doesn't raise her voice to be heard. She raises the standard of the truth until the lies simply have no air left to breathe." General Thorne moved to stand directly behind me, providing a wall of military authority that made the governor and the judges instinctively step back. They began to move away from the Davenports as if my family were contagious. The anniversary banner at the back of the hall began to tear away from the wall, a perfect metaphor for the Davenport legacy. Heavy, expensive, and finally, completely hollow. I wasn't the daughter they forgot. I was the person they couldn't ignore. I stood there, the architect of the aftermath, watching the true monsters emerge from behind the Davenport smile. I didn't realize it then, but the war for my freedom had just moved from the ballroom to the ledger. Would you protect a family that uses your pain as a product? Or is it finally time to let them face the law? I watched the last of the Davenport illusions shatter on the floor along with my mother's wine glass. The library of the Davenport estate was a tomb of leather-bound lies and mahogany secrets. At 10 o'clock that night, the air inside was suffocating, smelling of decaying paper and the sharp, metallic tang of the storm lashing against the tall windows. I stood by the grand desk, the shadows of the bookshelves stretching across the floor like skeletal fingers. Eugenia and Lysander burst through the heavy doors, their faces no longer masks of silver silk elegance. They looked feral, driven by the frantic desperation of cornered animals who had realized their sanctuary was a trap. Lysander didn't hesitate. He slammed a tablet onto the mahogany surface, a digital audit flickering on the screen with a malicious blue light. "You think you've won, Josephine," he spat, his voice a jagged rasp. "We have the logs. We have the metadata." He pointed a trembling finger at a list of forged transactions. "It shows you used your joint task force access to drain Grandma Eleanor's offshore accounts. You aren't a hero. You're a thief using a uniform to hide your greed." My mother stepped into the light, her eyes cold and calculating. "We've already drafted the report to the Pentagon," she sneered, her voice dripping with cloying venom. "Conduct unbecoming an officer. One phone call and your precious career is ash. Unless, of course, you sign over your military pension and the trust to cover the losses this family has suffered because of you. It's a small price for your silence." I stood perfectly still, watching the way Lysander's hands shook. Not with fury, but with the erratic rhythm of a liar whose world was collapsing. I didn't shout. I didn't defend my honor against people who didn't understand the word. They call it a family tree, but tonight it felt like a gallows. Strength isn't about winning every fight. It's about being the only one in the room who doesn't need to lie to survive. I looked at the forged audit and felt a cold, surgical clarity. "A lie can travel the world before the truth has its boots on," I said softly. "But the truth doesn't tire, and it's already in this room." Montgomery entered then, his face a pale ghost of the man who had pretended to be dying only hours ago. He carried a heavy, biometric-locked safe that had sat in Grandma Eleanor's bedroom for 20 years. "Enough," he muttered, his voice sounding hollow. Eleanor told me the worthy heir would open this when the time was right. My records say that's you, Lysander. Open it. Let's end this spectacle. Lysander stepped forward, his arrogance returning like a foul odor. He punched in the family anniversary. Red light, access denied. He tried his own birthday, then my father's, then the date the company was founded. Each time the safe hissed a mechanical rejection. The air in the room grew colder with every failed attempt. He began to sweat, his fingers fumbling over the keypad as he realized the worthy heir wasn't a title he could inherit by birthright. "Step back, Lysander," I said, my voice cutting through his panic like a steel blade. I walked to the safe, my movements rhythmic and deliberate. I didn't think of wealth or revenge. I thought of the only woman who had truly seen me. I punched in 4 digits. 0704. July 4th. The day I was officially commissioned as an officer. The date my parents had dismissed as a phase. The safe hissed, the heavy locking bolts retracting with a sound of absolute finality. The door swung open, revealing not gold or jewelry, but a series of sealed directives and a digital key glowing with an encrypted pulse. Resting on top was a handwritten letter. I recognized Grandma Eleanor's elegant script. I read the words aloud, her voice echoing through me. To the one who serves the many, I leave the keys to the kingdom. To those who only serve themselves, I leave the truth. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the low rumble of Georgia thunder. I realized then that my grandmother's true legacy wasn't the fortune, but the foresight to know that only honor could unlock the future. Character is what remains when the lights of fame are turned off. We are not defined by the names we are given, but by the promises we keep to ourselves. I picked up the digital key, its weight feeling like the first real thing I'd ever carried in this house. I walked to my laptop and inserted the key. A high-level encryption wall fell away, revealing the Davenport legal structure. "Hate to break it to you, Mother," I said, turning the screen so she could see the cold, black-and-white reality. Eleanor placed the entire Davenport estate into a spendthrift trust years ago. I am the sole trustee. I don't need your permission to be here. You need mine. Eugenia's face went white, her mouth working silently like a fish out of water. "I didn't seek this power to hurt you," I continued, my voice calm and authoritative. "I sought it because you've forgotten that a home is not a stage, and a daughter is not a prop. You spent 30 years trying to make me small. You only succeeded in making yourselves obsolete." I closed the laptop with a definitive click. "A full forensic audit of the Davenport Foundation starts at dawn," I informed them. "The federal investigators are already briefed. For the first time in your lives, I am not the one who should be afraid." I walked toward the library doors, the heavy digital key in my pocket feeling like a shield. It's funny how people only remember you have a duty to family when they want something from your pockets. Have you ever been the one they called useless until they needed a hero? I left them in the silence of their own making, the rain lashing against the windows like the storm I was about to unleash. The gray, sharp light of a Savannah dawn cut through the morning mist like a surgeon's scalpel. I stood on the wide veranda of the Davenport estate, the cold air lunging at my lungs, finally clear of the cloying scent of lilies and lies. The world was waking up, but for the legacy of this house, the sun was setting for the last time. Looking back now, I should have seen that some bridges are meant to be burned just so you can finally see the way home. The silence of the morning was shattered by the rhythmic crunch of gravel. A fleet of black SUVs pulled up the long driveway, their headlights cutting through the fog like tactical searchlights. I didn't flinch. I didn't hide. I stood at the top of the stairs, fully dressed in my military service blues for the first time under this roof. My silver eagles gleamed on my shoulders, reflecting a power that this family had spent 20 years trying to convince me I didn't possess. A storm doesn't ask for permission to wash away the salt. It simply restores the earth to its true state. I am not the storm. I am the architect of the aftermath. Gideon Sterling stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by 2 federal auditors and a pair of local sheriff deputies. He looked up at me and offered a crisp professional nod. He held a stack of court-ordered warrants in his hand, the final nails in a coffin built from decades of Davenport vanity. Behind me, the front doors creaked open. Eugenia and Montgomery descended into the foyer, their silk robes disheveled, their faces pale and unwashed in the unforgiving morning light. They looked at the sirens and the suits, finally realizing that their perfect anniversary party had officially become a federal crime scene. Eugenia's voice was a jagged screech that echoed off the marble walls. "What is this? Josephine, tell these people to leave our ancestral home immediately. You have no right to bring this shame to our door." I didn't raise my voice. I simply turned and walked to the marble console table in the center of the foyer, sliding a thick legal folder toward her. "You haven't been forgotten, Mother. You've been erased," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "This hasn't been your ancestral home for 3 years. You stopped paying the mortgage when Lysander convinced you to funnel the estate's maintenance funds into his shell companies. I used my personal assets and the Eleanor Trust to buy the delinquent debt from the bank months ago. I did it to prevent a public auction, but I didn't do it to save you." I watched her hands tremble as she looked at the official notice of foreclosure and the notice of trustee sale. The Davenport name was legally a ghost on its own property. Montgomery collapsed against the banister, his breath hitching in a way that was no longer theatrical. It was the sound of a man who had finally run out of air. A house built on lies cannot be saved by the roof. It must be reclaimed from the foundation, I said, looking him in the eye. "I didn't take this home from you. You lost it the moment you decided that your pride was more valuable than the truth." The processional thud of legal reality continued as the auditors moved toward the garage. I watched through this open door as they began tagging Lysander's luxury cars and cataloging Cressida's designer inventories, evidence for the stolen honor fraud. My brother and sister were dragged into the foyer by the deputies, their faces masks of feral shock. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound, heavy sense of duty. I signaled to the sheriff, handing him 2 specific documents. "Lysander, Cressida," I said, my voice ringing with the authority of a commanding officer. "These are your formal, 24-hour eviction notices. You are to leave this property immediately for the safety of the trust's assets. You are not allowed to take anything purchased with the fraudulent charity funds. Consider this your final tactical retreat." Eugenia lunged toward me, her fingers clawing at the air. "Josephine, please, family loyalty. We are your blood." I looked at her with a tragic, surgical clarity that made her flinch. "Family is not defined by the blood in your veins, Mother. It is defined by the hands that reach out to you when the world turns its back. You turned your back on me for 20 years. You called me a hippo. You sold my scars for profit. Today, I am not your daughter. I am simply the person closing the door." The cinematic finality of the moment settled over us like a shroud. Lysander was led out in handcuffs for questioning regarding the digital forgery of the audits, his bravado replaced by a whimpering silence. Cressida followed, sobbing as she was forced to leave with nothing but a single suitcase of clothes she had actually paid for. I watched from the porch, my spine a straight, unbreakable line of military discipline, as the last of the Davenport rot was purged from the estate. I realized then that Grandma Eleanor's true legacy wasn't the money or the land. It was the strength to stand alone in the truth while the world is screaming for a lie. I didn't win by taking revenge. I won by choosing to be a person they could no longer reach. I watched the last of Lysander's stolen luxury cars disappear down the driveway, the silence of the Savannah morning finally replacing the echoes of 20 years of mockery. She didn't win by raising her voice. She won by raising the standard of truth. Do you believe that some bridges are meant to be burned so you can finally see the way home? My parents stood trembling in the shadows of the foyer, 2 people who had finally run out of lies, as I turned toward the rising sun to decide what would become of the ruins they called a legacy. The grand ballroom behind us was a graveyard of crystal shards and spilled wine, the silence of the morning air heavy with the weight of things that could never be unsaid. The 400 guests were gone, leaving only the wreckage of their vanity behind, the anniversary banner hanging by a single thread, fluttering like a white flag of surrender. I stood in the center of the stripped foyer, my military uniform feeling like the only real thing in a world of cardboard cutouts. Eugenia and Montgomery looked smaller than I had ever remembered. Without the lights, the jewelry, and the audience, They were just two frightened people facing a dawn they hadn't planned for. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a single cream-colored envelope. I didn't feel the heat of revenge. I felt the cool, majestic serenity of a soul that had finally found its own horizon. "I am not leaving you homeless," I said, my voice a steady, rhythmic hum that mirrored the rustle of the oak trees outside. I handed the envelope to my father. Inside was a lifetime lease to a modest, comfortable cottage I had purchased in my own name, located 3 towns over. It was safe, it was quiet, and most importantly, it was far from the social circles they had poisoned. "There is an irrevocable support agreement attached. You will be provided for, but you will never have the legal power to touch a Davenport trust or use our name for a loan again." My mother looked at the lease, her eyes searching mine for a flicker of the hippo she could still manipulate. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "After everything, why do this?" I looked at her with clinical grace. "My forgiveness isn't a gift to you, Mother. It's a release for me. I am not my mother's daughter anymore. I am my own commander. I choose to be kind because you chose to be small." Gideon Sterling stood by the door, witnessing the signing of the agreement with the solemnity of a judge. For the first time, the tether was snapped. I wasn't running away. I was stepping through. By noon, the estate was flooded with a different kind of guest. I stood on the front lawn, the bright Savannah sky feeling like a clean slate, as General Thorne and a small gathering of local press arrived. I took the podium, the microphone clear and sharp. "Today," I announced, my voice full of quiet pride, "I am officially signing this estate over to the Eleanor Davenport Veterans Sanctuary." The place where I was once mocked and hidden would now become a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center for female soldiers returning from combat, the invisible pillars of our nation who, like me, knew the cost of silence. I revealed that the initial funding for the sanctuary came from the very charity money Lysander had stolen, now fully recovered and legally redirected by the Eleanor Trust. "Service isn't what we do for medals," I said, looking directly into the cameras. "It's what we do when no one is watching. A legacy isn't built on the stones of a mansion, but on the strength of the lives we help rebuild." This was the message my grandmother had intended all along. An hour later, I stood on the tarmac of the Savannah International Airport. The rhythmic hum of a jet engine vibrated in the soles of my boots. I was dressed in a civilian travel suit, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder, but my posture remained unmistakable. Gideon Sterling walked toward me, handing me a final black folder. "Your new orders, Joe? London mission. Diplomatic liaison." He shook my hand, not as a lawyer, but as an equal. "Go change the world. You already saved this corner of it." "Service never ends, Gideon," I replied with a faint, dangerous smile. "It only changes uniforms." As I climbed the stairs of the transport plane, I paused at the top and looked back at the Georgia horizon one last time. I remembered my own internal oath from the night before. I didn't win by taking their money. I won by choosing a life they could no longer reach. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming, the moment the mountain finally moved. I turned toward the vast blue sky and whispered the words Grandma Eleanor had left in her letter. Mission accomplished. The cabin of the aircraft was quiet, filled with the professional hum of a world that understood my value, a stark contrast to the ballroom where I was once a hippo. But now, I was simply a leader going home to her next duty. I opened my new mission file and felt the first true breath of freedom in my lungs. I didn't win by taking their money. I won by choosing a life they could no longer reach. I've learned that honor isn't a title given by those who share your blood. It's the quiet strength you forge when the world tries to make you small. Never let someone else's narrow lens define your horizon. If you've ever had to reclaim your own worth from a room full of lies, tell me your story below. I read every one.